In the autumn of 1880, on the open flats above the Loup River in Nebraska, the people of Halbeck Crossing watched Otto Reinhold do a thing that made no frontier sense at all. The snow had come early that year, hard and dry, and the old-timers had gone quiet over it, the way men go quiet when something is wrong. By November, the road north out of the crossing had already taken 2 men who tried to ride it and a boy who went out after a strayed steer. They did not bring the boy back. They marked the drift that took him and waited for the spring thaw to give him up. And Otto Reinhold, a 51-year-old wheat homesteader, a German immigrant the town had long since set aside, took his whole season's straw and began stacking it against the walls of his cabin. Not in the barn, not for the stock. He baled it, and he hauled it on a flat wagon up the rise to his cabin, and he stacked it. He stacked it like a man building a wall, bale on bale, course on course, 3 feet thick and tight against every outside wall, the dry straw climbing toward the eaves until the cabin disappeared inside it. He was wrapping his own home in a skin of dead grass. From the crossing, it looked like a man burying his house in a haystack and meaning to light a stove inside it. By the 3rd day, the flats had a name for it. Wade Mercer, who ran the store, called it the Haystack House. And worse, he called it a fire trap waiting on a spark, and the name stuck the way cruel names do. The Fool's Pyre, Reinhold's bonfire. They were certain the straw he was stacking around himself would be the thing that burned him alive before Christmas. They were wrong. That wall of straw would do something before the winter was out that no fire, no thicker log, and no extra cord of wood on that whole river could manage. If you value the kind of hard-earned knowledge the frontier never wrote down and never gave away easy, stay with this one to the end and tell us down below where in the country you're watching from. Because the men who laughed at the Haystack House did not understand the first thing about what was killing people that winter. And Otto Reinhold did. To understand the wall, you have to understand the man and the quiet thing that had been done to him. Otto Reinhold had come over from the Volga, from a German colony deep in the Russian steppe, where his people had farmed wheat in a cold that made a Nebraska winter look soft. He had crossed an ocean and half a continent with a strong back, a sack of hard turkey red seed wheat sewn into his coat lining, and almost no English in his mouth. He knew grain the way some men know horses. He knew straw, too, its weight, its dryness, the way a tight bale held still air in its heart, and a loose one let the wind walk through it. On the steppe, straw was not waste. It was wealth a man kept against the cold. His wife Greta had died the second winter they were on the Loup, not of any drama, of a lung sickness that took hold in a drafty cabin in a January when the wind found every seam in the green logs and would not let the stove stay ahead of it. He had burned wood all night, every night, and still he had watched her breath cloud white in the air a yard from the firebox. The fire was always hot. The room was always cold. He had not understood, then, how both of those things could be true at the same time. He understood it now. He had spent 2 winters understanding it. He had told himself, after, that he should have known. His own grandfather on the steppe had banked the colony's houses in straw every autumn, and they had held warm on next to nothing while the wind screamed across 1,000 miles of open grass. Otto had grown up inside that warmth, and he had come to America and built his wife a cabin out of bare green logs with the wind walking through the chinking, because here that was how a man was supposed to build, and he had let her breathe frost in it. That was the thing that sat in him through 2 winters. Not grief, exactly. The harder thing under the grief, that he had carried the answer across an ocean in his own memory, set it down, and forgotten it until the cost was paid. After Greta, the town stopped seeing him. He was the foreign wheat man, the widower who didn't talk, the Rusian who farmed too far out and kept odd ways. They were not cruel to his face. They simply set him aside, the way you set aside a tool you've decided you no longer need. But Otto Reinhold carried something they didn't know he had. He carried what old Klaus Vogel had taught him. Klaus Vogel had been the eldest of the Volga colony, a huge, slow man who had wintered 70 years on the open steppe and buried more men than he could count. And a steppe winter, Klaus used to say, was a thing with teeth, a wind that came 1,000 miles without a tree to slow it. Yet the colony lived through it every year, in low houses banked to the sills in straw, on almost no fuel, because there was almost no fuel to be had. How, young Otto had asked him once, how does dead grass keep a man warm? Klaus had not answered with words. He had taken the boy out to a fresh banked house wall and pushed his bare hand deep into the straw, all the way to the wrist, and held it there. Feel it, Klaus said. Warm in the deep. The straw makes no heat. It is full of small, still rooms of air, 1,000 of them, and air that does not move cannot carry the warm away. Moving air steals the heat off a house. Still air holds it where it is. The straw is nothing but a wall of trapped air, and a wall of trapped air is the warmest wall there is. Then he said the thing Otto would carry for the rest of his life, the thing he would say to himself 2 winters later over Greta's grave. The fire is not your friend, boy. The fire you must chase all night, and the night is longer than the fire. Build the wall that keeps what the fire gives, and a small fire will be enough. Heat that is kept lives longer than heat that is chased. Otto had nodded, the way a young man nods at an old man, not understanding. He understood at last in a cold cabin, watching his wife breathe smoke into a freezing room with a roaring stove 3 feet away. The fire made heat. The bare green logs let it go. The wind, finding every seam, came in and carried it off faster than the wood could replace it. Greta had not died of cold. She had died because the room could not hold what the fire gave it. A house does not freeze all at once. It leaks to death. So in the autumn of 1880, when the snow came a full month early, and the geese went south in a hurry, and the old dog would not leave the stove, Otto Reinhold looked at his thin-logged cabin and made up his mind. He would not chase the heat all winter and lose, the way he had lost before. He would build the wall his grandfather had built, the wall that holds the warm in, and he would build it out of the one thing his own fields had given him by the wagon load, for nothing. He would build it out of straw. He began in the stubble fields, where the threshed straw lay in long windrows gone gold and brittle in the early frost. He gathered it and bound it tight, the way his people bound it on the steppe. Not loose forkfuls, but hard-packed bales cinched double with twine until a man could stand on one and it would not give. A loose bale, Klaus had taught him, is half air the wind can move. A tight bale is 1,000 still rooms the wind cannot. He cut and bound and stacked the bales on the wagon, and the dry straw whispered under his hands, and he hauled load after load up the rise to the cabin behind his old draft horse. He measured before he built, the way Klaus had drilled into him. He paced off the cabin walls and reckoned his courses. The skirt would stand 3 feet thick all the way around. North, south, east, west, every wall the wind could reach, and climb to the top of the windows and on toward the eaves on the wind sides. He counted he would need better than 400 tight bales to wrap the whole cabin to that depth, and his fields, threshed out, had given him near 500. The straw he had once thought of as waste to be burned off in spring was, he saw now, a winter's wealth lying in his own stubble. He laid the first course tight against the cabin's outside walls, bale butted hard to bale all the way around, and a second course against the first, and a third, until the wall of straw stood 3 feet out from the logs. He drove sharpened stakes down through the courses to pin them so the wind could not pull a bale loose. He worked in mittens until the fine work, then bare gloves, and his hands cracked at the knuckles and bled, and he wrapped them in rag and kept on. The skirt climbed a course a day. The men of Halbeck Crossing rode out to watch and did not get down off their horses. "Building yourself a fine bonfire there, Reinhold," Silas Brenner called over the fence. "One spark out that stovepipe, and they'll see you burn clear to Grand Island." The others laughed, the way men laugh when a thing frightens them a little and they don't know why. Jeb Crowley spat in the snow. "Grew the straw, baled the straw, now he sleeps in the straw. Rusian's gone soft in the head. Man'll roast himself like a hog in a hay rick." By the third week, the straw skirt stood window high around all 4 walls of the cabin, 3 feet of tight gold bales, pinned with stakes, and beginning to vanish the cabin inside it, and the crossing had stopped calling it merely foolish, and started calling it the Haystack House. The name carried. Children rode out on the back of the mail sled to look at the crazy wheat man's hay house, and rode back with stories. The preacher at Halbeck Crossing worked it into a Sunday word about the vanity of men who trust in works of their own hands instead of providence and a good stout stove, and about the sin of a man who would tempt fire so. Otto did not answer any of it. He set another bale and drove another stake, and went back down to the windrows for more. He had learned a long time ago that you cannot argue a man out of a thing he has decided to find funny. You can only let the winter do the arguing. And the winter, he knew, was a patient and a thorough arguer, and it was coming. But here's where it nearly all went wrong. Because the first wall Otto Reinhold built was the wrong wall. He had been in a hurry with the snow already down, and he had set the bottom bales straight onto the cold bare ground, butted flat against the cabin's footing to save the labor of a base. Straw right down on the frozen earth, snug against the sill logs. It looked solid that way. It looked like more. It was a mistake, and the ground itself showed him within 2 weeks. The earth under the snow was not dry. It held the slow damp of the autumn rains, and that damp crept up into the bottom course of bales the way water climbs a lamp wick, soaking the straw from below. Wet straw is not still air. Wet straw is a sponge that carries the cold straight through, and worse, it begins to rot, to heat and sour and slump and pack down into a sodden mat. The bottom course darkened and sagged. The whole skirt settled and shifted as its footing gave, and the careful courses above pulled loose from the stakes and bellied out. He pushed his bare hand into the low straw on the north wall and felt it come out cold and wet to the wrist. The wall that should have held still air was wicking the ground, cold up into itself and hauling it tight against his logs. And the snow. Where the bales met the bare wall top with no cap to shed water, the daytime sun melted the surface snow, and the meltwater ran down into the straw and froze there by night, and the soaked, refrozen courses sagged worse. He held a candle to the inside of the cabin wall on the north side and watched the flame lean and gutter. The cold was coming straight through the rotting straw. He had built a thing that was eating itself from the bottom up. Down at the crossing, Wade Mercer heard about the slumping wall and laughed until he had to sit down. "The haystack house is composting," he told the store. "Ruzian's growing mushrooms on his own cabin. Won't even need a spark." Otto Reinhold stood in the snow and looked at his sagging, sour-smelling wall for a long time. And then he did the thing that, in the end, was the whole measure of the man. He did not defend it. He did not prop it. He tore it down. Course by course, he pulled the whole skirt apart, dragging out the rotted bottom bales and flinging them aside, back to the bare cabin walls, and the men who rode out to watch laughed harder than they had at any point yet. A fool building a hay house was funny. A fool tearing down his own hay house was the best show on the Lou all year. He let them laugh. In his head, he was hearing Klaus Vogel at the colony wall on the step. He remembered now what his hurry had let him forget, that on the old country the banked straw never sat on the bare earth, that the elders raised it and dried it and capped it every single time, and that he had skipped the one part that made the whole thing work. He had built like a man who'd forgotten everything. Now he built it the way it was meant to be built. First, he got the straw up off the ground. He laid a base of flat fieldstone and old planking all the way around the cabin, a hand's height above the earth, so no bale would ever touch the wet ground again. On top of that dry base, he set fresh, bone-dry bales he had kept stored in the loft of his barn, straw that had never seen the wet. Then he left a true gap. He set the skirt a hand's width out from the cabin logs and bridged the top of it, so a thin band of air ran between the dry straw and the wall, a place for any stray damp to breathe away instead of soaking in. The cabin would keep its heat to itself, the straw would keep the wind to itself, and between them and below them, dry, still, trapped air. Then he built the courses back, 3 feet thick, bale broken over bale like a stonemason breaks his joints, pinned with stakes driven slantwise, packed so tight the wind could find no loose seam to walk through. Into every gap between bales, he stuffed loose dry straw and tamped it hard with a board until the whole skirt was one unbroken body of still air with no channel through it. He gave the corners more than the walls. A corner is where 2 cold faces meet, and Klaus had taught him the cold finds it first and gnaws it hardest, so he carried the skirt around each corner a full extra foot and lapped the bales so no straight seam ran from the outside through to the logs. 3 feet of dead grass on the flat of the wall, near 4 at every corner. He thought of it the way the colony elders had. Not a wall a man builds once, but a coat a house wears, and a coat is thickest where the wind bites worst. And the cap. This time, he capped the whole skirt with a slanted course of overlapping boards, like a low shed roof leaning out from the cabin wall, so that snow and meltwater ran off clear of the straw and never soaked down into it again. At the very base, all the way around, he banked the loose snow up into a thick skirt against the foot of the bales, so the wind could not get under them, and the ground cold and the straw made one unbroken shoulder of white. He left 2 openings he had not bothered with the first time, because the first time he had not been thinking like Klaus. He cut a clear path to the door and framed it so it could be closed snug, and he set a small vent high under the cabin eave so the inside could breathe and the warm air would not sour and sweat. A shelter that cannot breathe drowns the people in it as surely as the cold kills them. Klaus had buried a man once who sealed his house too tight against a blizzard and never woke. Otto set a hinged board over the high vent that he could close in a blow and crack in a calm. It took him 11 days, working from dark to dark, his hands gone past pain into a kind of wooden certainty. He hauled near 400 dry bales out of the barn loft in those 11 days and tamped loose straw into the seams until his arms would not lift, and nailed up the slanted cap by lantern light long after the sun quit. The skirt rose again, taller now, to the eaves on the windsides, a clean, dry rampart of gold straw 3 feet deep with a hidden heart of trapped still air. He pushed his bare hand deep into the new wall and felt it come out dry and faintly warm. Not the wind, not the cold beyond it. Only the dull, even, held warmth of still air doing what Klaus had said it would. He went inside and lit the lamp and watched the flame. It stood up straight. It did not lean. It did not gutter. The wind was out there. He could hear it hunting along the straw, looking for the seam it used to know, but it could not find a way in. The flame breathed easy and stood tall, and for the first time in 2 winters, the inside logs of his cabin were dry to the touch and warm. That was the night the dog told him the truth. The dog was a rough, yellow-brown farm collie, an old, half-wild thing named Schatzi that had attached itself to him after Greta died. All that early winter, Schatzi had slept, jammed up against the stove, and would not go near the north wall of the cabin, the cold wall, the one that faced the worst of the wind. A dog knows where the cold lives. It will not lie against a wall that steals its warmth. But that night, with the straw skirt rebuilt dry and capped and tamped, and the lamp standing straight, Otto woke to find the stove gone to coals and the cabin still holding its warmth, and the dog had left the stove. Schatzi had crossed the whole room in the dark and lain down full length against the north wall. The wall it would not go near a week before. It lay there breathing slow and easy, the way an animal lies when it has found the safest place in the room. Otto Reinhold lay in the dark and listened to the wind fail to get in, and he understood that the wall worked. The fire had not changed. The wood had not changed. Only the wall had changed, and now the heat he made at night was still there in the morning. Still air is the warmest wall there is. Heat that is kept lives longer than heat that is chased. He had perhaps 3 weeks before the river told the rest of them the same thing, in a language none of them could laugh at. The blizzard of January, 1881, came down on the loop faster than any man living had seen. It came not as snow at first, but as a wall of gray on the northern sky at midday. And then the temperature fell off a cliff, 50 degrees in an afternoon. And then the wind arrived, and the wind was the thing that did the killing. It came across the open flats like a predator that had been waiting, low and fast and searching, and it went at the cabins of Hallbeck Crossing, one seam at a time. This was the moving air Klaus had warned about, the thief that carries off everything a fire makes. The crossing had good fires. Every chimney in the settlement ran hard. It did not matter. The wind walked through the green log seams and the door gaps and the chinking, and it carried the heat off into the dark faster than any stove could feed it, and the cabins began, one by one, to leak to death. In Silas Brenner's cabin, the inside north wall went white with frost by the second night, and his children slept in the one bed under every quilt and coat the family owned. In Jeb Crowley's place, the woodpile that should have lasted till March was gone in 8 days, because a leaking house burns wood the way a holed bucket loses water. You can pour all night and never fill it. Wade Mercer kept the store stove roaring around the clock, and still the back room glazed over with frost, and he and his wife dragged their bedding to the front and slept on the counter near the fire. Up and down the river, it was the same grave arithmetic. The fires were hot, the rooms were cold, the wind took everything the fires gave and would not stop taking. The numbers of it were plain to any man who would do the sum. A green log cabin with the wind in its seams loses heat faster than a single stove can pour it back, so the stove never gets ahead. It runs flat out around the clock, and the room hangs at a killing chill no matter how the fire roars. To gain a degree, a man must burn more, and the more he burns, the faster the wind takes it, until the woodpile is gone and the cold walks in unopposed. Silas Brenner had cut a generous winter's wood, better than 3 cords against the spring. He burned the last of it on the 7th night and stood in his doorway in the white roar with an axe, nothing left in the world to cut. A man named Ott, who had homesteaded a half-section east of the crossing, drove his milk cows into the lee of his soddy the first night, and by the 3rd morning they stood frozen on their feet in a row. The breath turned to white frost on their muzzles, killed standing by the moving air against the still meat of their bodies. 2 men went out in the white to bring stovewood from a shed 40 feet from the door, and one of them did not find his way back until the storm broke, and by then there was nothing in him left to warm. This was the wind doing the arguing. This was the thing Otto Reinhold had understood while they laughed, that cold alone is slow, but moving air is quick, and a room does not freeze all at once. It leaks to death, one seam at a time, while the fire roars and the wood runs out. And on the rise above the river, inside the haystack house, Otto Reinhold sat warm. The skirt held. The wind hunted along the outer straw and found nothing. No loose bale, no open seam, no way under the snow-banked foot or down past the slanted cap. The 3 feet of tight straw sat full of dead, trapped air and would not carry the cold across. The cabin's own warmth, kept off the straw by that hand's width of air, stayed where it belonged. Inside the skirt, the lamp flames stood up straight and unbothered, hour after hour, and the dog had left the stove for good now and slept its whole length against the once cold wall. He burned a small, steady fire, not a roaring one. A roaring fire is a man chasing heat. He did not need to chase it. The wall held what he made, and so he made only a little, and a little was enough. He cracked the high vent in the calm hours to let the cabin breathe, and closed it in the worst of the blow, and the inside log stayed dry and bare of frost the whole storm through. He slept long and easy. He ate hot. He read his old country Bible by the lamp. A few miles off, the territory was logging the coldest week it would ever write down, and inside the haystack house, a man and a dog were warm enough to be bored. He fought the storm only once, and that one fight was the whole truth of the build. On the 3rd night, the wind, after hunting the skirt for days, finally found one weakness, a place on the west wall where a stake had heaved in the frost, and a bale had worked an inch loose, and a thin blade of cold came whistling through the seam into the cabin and bent the lamp flame for the first time in weeks. Otto heard it before he felt it. He knew that sound. He pulled on his buffalo coat and his red muffler and went out into the black roar of the blizzard with a lantern and a fork of loose straw, and he found the loose bale by holding his bare hand near the wall until the cold bit it, and he drove the stake home again and rammed fresh straw hard into the seam until it was one body with the rest. The skirt closed back around the cabin like a held breath. The flame inside stood up straight again. He came in shaking the snow off his coat, and the dog thumped its tail once against the straw wall and went back to sleep. That was the whole war. One seam, one night, one armful of straw. While the town below burned its winter's wood in a week and watched the frost climb its inside walls, Otto Reinhold's only battle was a single loose bale, fought and won in 10 minutes in the dark. He kept a kind of vigil through those 5 days, though it was a calm one. Each morning he cracked the high vent and read the cabin the way another man reads weather, by the lamp flame, which stood straight, by the inside of the logs, which stayed dry under his palm, by the dog, which had not once gone back to the stove. Each evening he walked the inside of the skirt with a candle, holding it to every wall and every corner and every window sill, watching for the lean that would tell him the wind had found a seam. The flame leaned but the once, and he understood, in those long, quiet hours, while the territory died around him, the whole of what his grandfather's people had known on the steppe 100 winters running. Survival in that country was not a thing a man won in a roaring fight against the cold. It was a thing he set up beforehand in the autumn with his hands and his patience, and then sat quietly inside of, while the storm spent itself against a wall it could not move. The men below were fighting for their lives. He was only waiting out the weather. That was the whole difference, and it was the difference between the living and the dead. He thought, more than once, of riding down to the crossing to help. But the road was a killing thing now, and he had no way to carry warmth to a house that could not hold it. The straw could not be hauled and stacked in the teeth of a blizzard. It had to have been done in the calm of autumn, when the doing looked like folly. The time to build the wall was the time they had spent laughing at him. The storm blew itself out on the 5th day. The sky went hard and blue and merciless, and the open-air thermometer at the railroad's grading camp, a few miles east, was found frozen down past its mercury, below 40 degrees under naught. It was the kind of cold that kills a standing horse. The flats around Halbeck Crossing were littered with the proof of it come morning. And that was when Dr. Lewis Carver rode out to the haystack house expecting to dig out a corpse. Carver was a railroad surveyor's physician, a young company doctor sent down the Lou after the storm to count the living and the dead. He had heard the whole sorry tale of the foreign wheat man who had buried his cabin in flammable hay, and he came up the rise grimly certain of what he would find. A frozen man, or the black ruin of a place that had burned. He carried a mercury thermometer in a brass and wood case to log the conditions of the bodies. He knocked on a door framed in 3 feet of gold straw, and Otto Reinhold opened it, alive and warm, in his shirt sleeves, with a dog at his heel and a small fire ticking in the stove. Carver stood a long moment and said nothing. Then he took out the thermometer, because numbers were the only thing a company man trusted, and he began to measure. He set the mercury thermometer in the open air, an arm's length from the wall, in the lee of the morning sun, and the cold drove the silver column down and down until it stood at 40 below naught. 40 degrees of frost under nothing. Then he carried the same instrument through the straw-frame door and set it on the table inside, and they watched it together in the lamplight as the column woke and climbed, past 0, past 20, past 40, and settled, steady, at a hair above 46 degrees above naught. 86 degrees. 86 degrees of difference across 3 feet of stacked straw, with one small fire doing the easy half of the work. He measured it twice more to be sure his instrument had not lied, then read it at 5 stations along the wall and wrote down each one: 40 below in the open air, 11 below an inch into the outer straw, 16 above at the middle of the 3-foot skirt, 31 above in the hand's-width gap against the logs, and 46 above in the room itself. 5 readings, climbing in even steps from the killing cold of the open to the easy warmth of the table, and not one of them sudden, the cold dying a little at every inch it tried to cross. A leaking cabin had no such steps. There, the outside cold and the inside cold were nearly the same number, because the wind carried the one straight into the other, with nothing to slow it. The heart of the straw sat at a steady warmth that did not move with the storm or the sun. Dead air, holding still, the 1,000 small rooms Klaus had once made a boy feel with his bare hand. Carver pressed his palm to the inside wall and felt the dull, even warmth that had held all storm, then walked out and laid it on the snow-crusted outer straw and felt the killing cold of the open. And the wall of dead grass stood between the two of them and let neither pass. "How much wood?" Carver asked quietly. "Have you burned through the whole of this storm?" Otto showed him the woodpile. He had burned, in 5 days of the worst cold the territory had ever logged, a little under 1 cord. Down at the crossing, the men who had laughed had burned 4 cords apiece and frozen anyway, because a leaking house can never be filled. Carver was quiet for a long while. He was a young man and a trained one, and he had ridden out sure of his own knowledge, with a thermometer to log the dead. He put the thermometer back in its case with hands that were not quite steady. "I had it wrong," he said at last. "We all did. I thought the fire made the heat. I thought a man froze for want of a bigger fire, or burned for want of sense." He pushed his bare hand deep into the gold straw, the way Klaus Vogel had once pushed a boy's hand into a colony wall. "It was never the fire. The wall keeps what the fire makes. All this straw does is stop the wind from stealing it." Otto Reinhold nodded. He did not gloat. He had not built the wall to be proven right. He had built it because he had watched a fire fail his wife with the wood stacked high beside it, and he had finally understood why. "The straw makes no heat," he said. It was the only thing he said. "It only keeps the wind from stealing what little a man has. Still air is the warmest wall there is." Carver wrote it all down. The 86 degrees, the single cord of wood, the 3-foot skirt, the dry raised base, the air gap, the slanted cap, the banked foot. He wrote it into the company record, and he carried it back to the crossing, and a doctor's numbers travel where a foreign widower's words never could. By the next autumn they were banking the straw walls up and down the loop, raised on a dry base, gapped off the logs, capped to shed the snow. And the threshing floors gave them the bales for free, the same straw they had once laughed at him for stacking. They banked it on barns to bring the stock through, and around the schoolhouse so the children would not freeze at their desks. They learned the dry base and the air gap and the breathing vent. And the men who got the bottom course wet and watched it rot came up the rise, hats in hand, to ask the foreign wheat man how he had done it. They called it the Reinhold Bank, a man's name, on a thing that kept his neighbors alive. Otto Reinhold did not become a celebrated man. He grew his hard red wheat the next summer, the same as always, and threshed it and baled the straw against the coming cold. But the men at the store made room for him now, and Wade Mercer, who had named the haystack house, was the first to come ask him, plain and humbled, how to raise the base so the bottom bales would not draw the wet. Otto told him the one thing that mattered more than all the rest, that the straw was only worth the labor if it was bone dry and stayed bone dry, because a wet wall lies to a man and tells him he is safe while it carries the cold straight to his bed. The man who had laughed loudest took the most careful notes of all. On the last evening of that first hard winter, with the light going long and blue across the snow and the first stars cold and clean over the frozen loo, Otto Reinhold stood at the foot of his straw wall with the old dog beside him. He pushed one bare hand deep into the gold straw, the same gesture, always the same, and felt the held warmth in the deep of it. He was 51 years old, and he had buried a wife he could not keep warm, and he had built, out of the dead grass of his own fields, the thing that would have saved her. Shotzi leaned its weight against the straw and against his leg. The lamp behind the one small window stood up straight and golden in the blue. A fire is a thing you have to keep chasing. A wall is a thing that keeps for you. Greta had taught him the cost of not knowing it, and Klaus had given him the words, and the winter of 1881 had carved it into the valley in numbers no man could laugh away. Still air is the warmest wall there is, and heat that is kept lives longer than heat that is chased. The frontier knew it once in the cold by hard arithmetic, and then the world got warm and easy and let the knowing slip away. So, here's the question I'll leave you with tonight before the lamp goes out and the cold comes down. What hard, simple life or death thing did the people who came before us understand about staying alive through a winter? Something they paid for in blood and frost and learned by hand, that we, in all our warm and easy rooms, have already let ourselves forget.